The jazz band's velvet melody slid through the ballroom, while candlelight put halos on the rims of crystal glasses, and I sat with my 7-year-old grandson, Leo, the boy I'd follow into any storm. He pushed a red toy car over the white tablecloth, the small wheels whispering across linen like a secret he hadn't found the courage to tell me yet. My son, Alex, moved from table to table in a navy suit that fit him like good news, raising a glass and practicing a smile that wanted to be happiness. Beside the dance floor, his new wife Ava shone in beads and bright laughter, her voice lifting over the band as if the night had been tuned for her alone. The floral centerpieces were perfect armies of white roses. The waiters glided past with trays of shrimp and champagne. I straightened Leo's tiny bow tie and felt that soft sting a grandmother never quite gets used to, the touch that summons every memory of the child's mother. Maria's absence had a temperature, a draft in the soul that never stopped. Leo's eyes were Maria's eyes, clear and careful. When I slipped him a small square of cake, he thanked me with a look and went back to his car. But then the toy stilled, and those careful eyes climbed to mine with a seriousness I'd only seen on nights when fevers ran hot and breaths came quick. He squeezed my hand cold, urgent, and whispered a plea that changed everything. He wanted to leave right then without a sound, as if the room itself had become dangerous. I asked what was wrong. His mouth trembled. He asked if I'd looked under the table. I raised the linen and saw that small folded square by his shoes, a scrap that should have been nothing and was instead a blade. The candlelight found the ink when I opened it. Table 8, add shrimp to the child's serving. The words were clumsy and lethal. Leo's allergy had nearly killed him once. The whole family knew. I felt the room tilt, the roses, the music, the cold silver, Ava's laughter, Alex's practiced smile. Everything slid slightly askew, while I gripped Leo's fingers and pulled air into my lungs like a task. I tucked the note into my palm, stood, and hugged my grandson against me, thinking of the wind-beaten days when his mother would stand on her porch in Phoenix with a basket of garden vegetables and a soft voice that steadied the entire neighborhood. Maria had been sunlight in sensible shoes, the sort of daughter-in-law whose gratitude was quiet, whose kindness was a habit, who once held a fevered baby through the longest night of my life, while I whispered it will break, and stared at the horizon, begging the sun to prove me right. But the world had not been built to keep sunlight. One afternoon, the highway took Maria away in a shriek of metal and rain, and grief made new rooms in our house. Alex's laugh folded in on itself. Leo learned the shape of silence. I became a bridge the family crossed daily, steady and ordinary, needed and constant, telling bedtime stories about a mother whose songs still warmed pillows and whose hands cut fruit into perfect moons. In time, Alex brought a woman to my table. He wanted me to meet someone special. I rinsed my hands, smoothed my fear, and opened the door. Ava stepped in like she owned her own spotlight, a practiced smile, perfect hair praise, for my house that scanned the walls like inventory, and paused just a touch too long on the photograph of Maria hugging a tiny Leo. She was attentive and eager, washing dishes she hadn't dirtied, humming a bright tune while the sink gleamed. Yet when she offered Leo a chocolate with a voice sugar sweet, he didn't move. He tilted away, clutching his spoon as if it were a secret. Later, when she thought I was in the kitchen, I heard her voice harden, telling him to be still, telling him he was too old to act like a baby. By the time I stepped back into the room, the tune was back, the smile reassembled, and she was praising his block tower as if she'd never snapped its pieces with her tone. I told myself I was being unkind, too suspicious that grief makes instruments out of shadows. I looked away. The small signs collected. In the grocery store line, she complained that he had dropped candy and made her pay. At his 7th birthday, she clapped politely from a corner, while my adopted daughter Lucy baked him a cake that lit his whole face. In the park, he returned with a dirty shirt and a quiet "you don't argue with." When his teacher pulled me aside to say he had gone very quiet in class, I told myself the year had been heavy. But on a walk home, Leo gripped my blouse and whispered that he didn't want to go back to Miss Ava. It could be clumsiness with children, I argued with myself. It could be my protectiveness making villains where there were none. It could be. It also could not. The thorn I'd been ignoring pushed deeper. Lucy saw it too. She didn't say so, but the way she bent toward Leo, the way she watched Ava's hand fold over Alex's, the way she flushed and lowered her eyes, told me the truth had begun to show itself in tremors. The wedding was a cathedral of spectacle. Shrimp glistened on silver. A band rendered joy into brass and velvet. When Leo nudged that toy car off the cloth and ducked beneath the table and froze when his hand found mine and pressed like prayer, when I lifted the linen and found the note the world sharpened into a needle. I stepped into the hall storm in my chest and found the young waiter David, who had visited our table with nervous kindness all evening. I showed him the scrap. His face drained as if the ink had soaked his blood. He said a woman had handed it to him to relay to the kitchen, and he dropped it between trays. His voice shook. He hadn't known. He hadn't known. The band swelled inside. My grandson's life had been perched on a folded square of paper, and this room of roses and brass had almost made murder look like supper. I went back and note in my fist and felt Leo's fear like a current against my side. I stood and raised my voice before the servers poured the main course. I called the room to attention, and the room obeyed. I laid the note on our table and asked a single plain question, the way a hammer asks a bell if it is made of metal: who wrote this? Conversation died like a candle pinched between damp fingers. Alex came toward me smiling until he took the paper red and turned the color of an unlit wick. Ava approached, confusion arranged on her face, benevolence pasted to her words, an actress in the first act of innocence. She implied accidents. She suggested pranks. She asked whether we should let a child's discovery ruin an evening. I didn't answer her. Lucy did. She stood with Leo tucked under her arm and told the room to stop being polite. The sound of her hand against Ava's cheek cracked the spell the party had been casting, and every face in the room turned from performance to plot. A breath later, the young waiter confirmed it. He had received the note from a woman. He had dropped it. He had meant no harm. Then a voice I hadn't expected, Ava's teenage sister, rose from a nearby table, her confession trembling into the microphone of silence the paper had passed through her hands because her sister asked her to deliver it. It was a small act, a favor between siblings, not a murder she'd intended to abet. She wept. Ava told her to stop lying. Lucy, calm as a gavel, said we could check the cameras. Ava didn't say another word after that, and sometimes silence is as good as a signature. The ballroom waited for Ava to choose a story other than the truth. Alex stood in the soft theater light of public humiliation, looking at the woman he'd just promised to love, and seeing at last what he'd refused to believe. I watched him scan the note, look at his son, search Ava's face for a version of the world where she had not targeted a child's throat with a shellfish. There wasn't one. The elegance of the night had disguised the simplest cruelty, envy wrapped in satin. It came apart under a single question, the way cheap ribbon phrase under a fingernail. The murmur in the room became a voice with many throats. How could this happen? Who would do such a thing? Why a child? A hotel manager and 2 security guards drifted toward us, as if drawn by the gravity of a verdict. I told the story plainly, for those who had missed the first telling. Leo's allergy, the note, the attempted substitution, the waiter's testimony, the sister's confession, the cameras. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The sentence had been written by deeds, not words. Some guests looked away ashamed to have toasted so loudly in a room that held this kind of quiet violence. Others held my gaze like neighbors who have decided offense is a form of love. Ava tried one last time, but fake innocence always breaks under the weight of a minor witness. The sister's tears made any performance ugly by comparison. Hotel security asked Ava to step outside. She looked for a rescuer and found none. The people who had applauded her entrance could not find any clapping left. As she went, I felt two griefs, the first for the danger that had reached for my grandson's life in a room full of music. The second, for my son who had wrapped his hunger for relief in the person of a woman who hid her coldness in kindness. Betrayal always has two victims, the one who is harmed and the one who must realize they aided their own undoing. The fallout was not cinematic. It was softer than that and far more honest. Ava left under escort. The band stuttered to a stop. Someone dimmed the chandeliers as if less light could shrink the reality on our plates. Alex went to his knees beside Leo and apologized for not seeing sooner, for the ways grief had made him selfish, for letting a stranger near our house with a smile like a lockpick. Leo listened and then leaned into his father, the way children forgive more quickly than they should. I put my hand on Alex's shoulder, this grown man, whose first scraped knee I had kissed exactly like this, and told him that luck had not saved us. Attention had. Attention paid by a child, and honored by the adults who loved him. Lucy reached for Leo and held him like proof that we had come back from a cliff's edge and could go home by another road. The story traveled in the days that followed like smoke through screens, like scandal down hallways. Phones rung and rung. Some relatives blamed Alex for being the kind of lonely that makes bad choices look like salvation. Others congratulated me for acting at the table instead of whispering in the kitchen. But blame is a lazy god and rarely grants what people hope it will. Leo needed steadiness, not commentary. Alex needed quiet, not a courtroom. I cooked the foods that had always meant safety in our house, and the kitchen remembered him. Cheesy pasta, tender puddings. Lucy packed lunches for school with drawings and notes that made the teachers smile and checked the list twice for allergens. She told bedtime stories about brave small birds flying through storms and about kites that refused to come down. And when Leo ran a fever one Tuesday, she sat beside him through the night, changing cloths, measuring breaths, humming the kind of song Maria would have hummed if she'd been given more time. I watched from the doorway and understood something I'd been polite about. Not seeing, sometimes love grows in the rooms, grief empties, and sometimes the family you need is the one you assemble with patience rather than the one you inherit with paperwork. Alex was quieter. Guilt is an anchor with too short a chain dragging you in circles around the same rock. He woke early, took Leo to school, learned the feel of being present. He stopped saying Ava's name out loud as if giving it breath might invite the past to sit down again. The house itself untensed. The corners where laughter had stopped began to remember how to echo. Leo's voice returned first louder on the playground, louder over crayons, louder at the top of slides with Lucy beneath them saying, "I'm here." I saw Alex watch Lucy with an expression I recognized from his childhood, when he learned a thing mattered and didn't know how to reach for it without breaking it. There was a night, the three of us around the table, pasta steaming a soft cloud up between us, when Leo set down his fork and said in a voice that belonged to both the child and the boy he was becoming that he wanted Aunt Lucy to be his mommy. Lucy flushed. Alex closed his eyes and opened them with a shine I hadn't seen since before the highway took Maria away. I put my hand over his and told him happiness wasn't built from gowns and photographs. It was a habit made of kindness and a willingness to do dishes without being asked. I'm not romantic about suffering. It doesn't ennoble. It doesn't fortify by default. It takes and takes unless you learn to tell it when to stop. But there are seasons in a family's life when the harvest comes from scars. The wedding had been a pageant. The aftermath was a garden. We pulled weeds named secrecy and appeasement. We planted rows named boundary and vigilance and patience. The first shoots appeared quickly. Leo's laughter, Alex's quiet, Lucy's unspectacular daily love. The deeper roots took longer trust in ourselves, not only in our hopes, attention to what is not only to what we need, the courage to face a room when a room must be faced. I thought often about the waiter's trembling hands and the sister's confession about all the people whose small acts mattered and whose decisions kept a catastrophe from becoming a tragedy. The moral was not that evil is rare. It was that attention is a kind of prayer, and community is what happens when enough people choose to answer it. Summer laid a warm palm on our roof, and the house, relieved of its masquerade, settled into ordinary music, the familiar click of the thermostat, the whisper of leaves against windows, the footfall of a child testing new games down the hall. I opened the curtains wide each morning, like a ritual of refusal, no more shadows for what lives here. Lucy and Leo turned the yard into a compass of small triumphs. They flew a kite that snagged and finally rose. They drew hopscotch grids that advanced farther each day, ambitious chalk numbers reaching the fence like declarations. When Leo stumbled, the hands that lifted him up were always ready, always the same, and he learned to try again because it felt safe to try again. Safety is the soil of courage. You can't grow much without it. Workshops began the way a lot of good things do, quietly in a borrowed room with folding tables and burnt coffee. Vincent, the elder law attorney who had helped me in another battle, I thought would be the last of my life, returned with a stack of plain language handouts and a patient way of translating legal teeth into human words. I told our story, yes, the wedding, but also the years that make a wedding mean more than a dress, and watched women and men of all ages recognize themselves in parts of it. They had nephews who'd found their pensions, daughters-in-law whose sweetness turned to salt in kitchens with no witnesses, sons who had worn grief like a crown that absolved them of the duty to be kind. We didn't offer shame. We offered vocabulary, words like undue influence and restricted accounts and advanced directives. We offered permission to say no and the practical scripts for how that no sounds when family is used to a yes. People cried. Then they took notes. Then they hugged me with that fierce relief that happens when your private fear is spoken in a room and no one blinks. At home, the kitchen was where healing practiced. It's hard to lie about who you are when you share a sink. Lucy cooked simply and well always, checking labels, always placing a little paper note in Leo's lunch with a ridiculous cartoon of a hero beat or a dancing spoon. The school sent home a drawing of a family child in the middle, two adults on either side, one with hair that looked suspiciously like mine, the other with Lucy's careful smile. Alex stuck it to the refrigerator with a magnet from a beach we had visited once before life turned its corner. He stood there staring at it, and then at Lucy, as if the geography of his heart had a new map, and he was deciding he liked its coastline. He apologized one evening, not with flowers or speeches, but with participation, washing pans, packing backpacks, sitting on the floor to read the same book 3 times, because Leo wanted the same absurd joke to land in the same place. That is how atonement looks when it intends to last. Slow, repetitive, sturdy. People think apology is a sentence. It isn't. It's architecture. Ava became an absence instead of a subject. Rumor moved on to feed on newer meals. I caught myself sometimes trying to rewrite what had happened. Maybe she didn't intend that level of harm. Maybe she had been driven by envy that could be understood, which is not the same as forgiven. But then I would see Leo's small hand shaking at a table, and remember the way some people measure their wants against the lives of others and don't mind when the scale tips toward cruelty. Understanding is a grace you can extend without granting entrance back into your house. You can wish someone healing and never again invite their hunger to sit where your child eats. There was a Sunday night when the house smelled of tomatoes and basil, and the low hum of fans kept Summer from pressing too hard. After we ate, Alex cleared the table and stood in front of the living room chair, where I'd watched him sleep on my chest 30-some years earlier, his voice steady as he told me something simple and large. He had been blind. He didn't want to be blind anymore. He wanted to build a life that thanked the people who had kept his son alive while he wandered halls looking for a mirror that told him he was whole. He reached for Lucy's hand with a gratitude that didn't perform itself, but made itself known in the gentle way his fingers asked for hers. She said yes without saying it, the kind of yes that has been practicing in small acts for a long time and only needed to be named. Grief and joy can share a house. I used to think you had to choose a single tenant. That night, while I washed bowls and watched their heads bent together over a school calendar, I understood that the heart is better constructed than I'd given it credit for. There was room for Maria still. There would always be room for the woman whose portrait watched us from the wall and blessed us with the generosity of the love she gave and the love she'd no doubt want us to keep learning. There was room for Lucy, who never tried to wear another woman's shape, but stood in her own tenderness next to the boy whose life she sheltered. There was room for Alex, unlearning the kind of masculinity that hardens and learning the kind that holds. There was room for Leo's future, which had turned on a single folded square of paper and then righted itself. On the anniversary of the wedding, I lit a candle in the kitchen anyway. Rituals needn't belong to only the unspoiled days. I set the note I had saved, now sealed in a plastic sleeve, inside a folder marked attention next to my cup for a minute, not to brood, but to remember. Attention had saved us, and attention would keep saving us if we kept it fed with facts and boundaries and the courage to interrupt a band when a band must be interrupted. I blew the candle out and opened the window. The house breathed. So did I. Autumn wrote its colors on the trees, and inside, we wrote a new ending to a year that could have broken us open and left us empty. We chose instead to be containers for something kinder. It didn't happen by accident. It happened because we learned to honor the signal of a child's fear, because we brought our private worry into a public room, because we kept telling the truth even when the truth embarrassed us, and because love in its least glamorous form, showing up with a mop rereading a story, packing a lunch with care does more good than any glittering vow spoken in a hall of roses. On a crisp Saturday, Alex and Lucy took Leo back to the park, where months before he had returned quiet and dirty and unwilling to talk. They went early when the slides were cold, and the sky's blue still wore a little gray. Lucy taught him to climb the small wall he'd once avoided, telling him where to put his hands, where to trust his feet. He reached the top and looked back at the two people who would catch him if he slipped. He didn't slip. He was changing right under our eyes from the boy who waited to the boy who tried. Confidence is a generosity grown-ups can give to children. We had learned this truth again, and now we practiced it. Our workshops moved from borrowed rooms to schedules and flyers, and a line of people at the door who brought their own folded notes not written in ink, but shaped like stories that had needed a place to be believed. We expanded the curriculum to include allergy protocols for families hosting events, a list that started with a question venues should ask, and ended with who needs to know what and when. It looked at a distance like bureaucracy, and maybe some of it was. But to the grandmother at table 8, bureaucracy is a blueprint for survival. We grew a small network of restaurant managers and hotel staff who wanted to be better than the night had shown them. David, the waiter, attended one session and spoke about the moment a note turned his hands to ice and how he had decided to learn everything he could about what should never be changed on a child's plate. People clapped for him the way they clap for courage that looks like admission and repair. Alex went back to counseling and brought home questions instead of answers, which is how I knew it was good. He asked how to talk to a child about loyalty that doesn't erase the past, how to honor a dead spouse while courting a living love, how to keep apology from becoming a performance that demands applause. He didn't always like the work. Growth rarely feels like applause-worthy work. It feels like sanding a splinter in a place you didn't know could ache. But he kept showing up. He asked Leo what games he wanted to play instead of telling him, and learned the smaller boy knew better games. He asked Lucy what she needed when she was tired, and sometimes she said an hour alone in her room with a book, and he said, "Okay," and meant it. He began to see that protecting your family isn't only about standing in front of the door. It's about building a life inside that makes the door less likely to be tested. I walked the house at night sometimes, not with fear, but with gratitude that needed motion. The armchair where I had once watched Ava's smile harden now held my blanket and the last pages of the library book I'd been savoring slowly. The table where I had once slapped a note like a warrant now hosted jigsaw puzzles whose missing pieces always turned up under a cushion, never under a threat. I would stand by the window and think of Maria not only for the loss, but for the legacy. She had made this family's first map. We had been blown off course, but not shipwrecked, because the land she charted a home built of daily kindness still existed, and we could aim for it again. The question people ask always in a lowered voice, as if the mere idea might bring the past back like a stray dog, is whether I would do the same thing again, make a scene at a wedding, raise my voice, name the wrongdoing, and throw a veil over the evening's performance. Yes, and sooner. I say it politely because life has taught me that righteous anger delivered with a steady hand carries farther than rage. The lesson that makes all the other lessons possible is this peace that requires you to lie is not a peace worth keeping. I tell grandmothers this at the workshops, and they nod with that weary relief that looks like a prayer answered late, but answered. On a winter evening that came early and wore a blue scarf, Alex lit a fire in the grate, and with Leo tucked against his side, asked Lucy a question that had been waiting on his tongue all autumn. He didn't promise her perfection. He promised participation. He didn't compare her to anyone else. He named who she was to the boy sleeping on his arm and to the woman staring back from the mantel in a wooden frame. He asked if she wanted to be part of the work of this family in a way that came with rings and the right to call what she had already been doing by its true name. She cried the way acceptance cries, quiet, grateful, unafraid. Leo woke enough to smile and then fell back into the easy sleep of a child who knows where the exits are and has no need of them. We didn't throw a second wedding like the first. We ate soup and bread. We told stories that were true. We asked the people we loved to come sit and bring their ordinary, which is to say, bring the best part of themselves. There were flowers, but they came from our yard. There was music, but it came from a radio on the counter between pots. There was cake, of course, and a little boy who blew out candles with a grin, not a flinch. If you need a last lesson here, it is the one we keep close on the days when old fear tries to rattle a window. Family is not proof you will never be harmed. Family is the promise that when harm tries, the people at the table will face it with you and name it and not let it pass. Love is not the speech in a bright hall. Love is the hand you feel under the table, cold and urgent, and the hand that takes it stands up and says no, when no is the truest blessing. If this story found you at the right time, hold its small folded note the way I did not as a relic of danger, but as a reminder that attention saves lives and that the courage to speak in public is a form of care no ribbon can rival. And should you ever have the choice between silence that preserves a performance and truth that protects a child, you already know what to do. Thank you for staying with me to the end. If this story moved you or gave you strength, please like, share, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what part spoke to you most. Your voice might be the candle someone else needs.